At 12:42 in the afternoon on July the 20th, 1944, a briefcase packed with plastic explosive sat inside a wooden hut in East Prussia, positioned deliberately close enough to kill the man standing directly beside it during a routine military briefing. Adolf Hitler had no idea the bomb existed. He also had no idea that minutes earlier, another officer had unknowingly moved that same briefcase, shifting it just far enough behind a heavy oak table leg to change the entire outcome of the war that followed for the remaining 9 months of its own continued fighting. This is the story of the July the 20th plot, the closest any assassination attempt ever actually came to killing Adolf Hitler, and the single accidental gesture that decided whether the plan succeeded or failed within a matter of seconds. Every week, we take apart a moment when a war turned, the people who made it happen, and the razor-thin margin between disaster and victory. Subscribe if that is the kind of history you want more of. By the summer of 1944, a growing circle of senior German military officers and civilian officials had concluded that Hitler's own continued leadership was leading Germany toward total, irreversible destruction. With Soviet forces advancing steadily from the east and Allied armies already ashore in France, following the Normandy landings that same June, a two-front military collapse this channel has already documented from multiple separate perspectives. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, an aristocratic officer whose own wartime service had already cost him one eye, one hand, and 2 fingers on his remaining hand during earlier fighting in North Africa, emerged as the conspiracy's own most determined and most capable member, a man whose own devout Catholic faith and first-hand battlefield experience had convinced him that removing Hitler represented a moral obligation rather than simply a political calculation made from any position of personal safety. Stauffenberg's own position on the German General Staff gave him direct, regular access to Hitler's own military briefings, precisely the kind of proximity the conspiracy actually needed to physically place a bomb close enough to the target to guarantee success, where earlier, more distant assassination attempts had already failed. Before we get into what actually happened once Stauffenberg reached Hitler's own headquarters that morning, if you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. It costs nothing and it helps the channel keep telling these stories. Stauffenberg traveled to the Wolfschanz, Hitler's own heavily fortified field headquarters in East Prussia, known in English as the Wolf's Lair, carrying a briefcase containing 2 separate bombs, plastic explosive charges he intended to arm and place directly beside Hitler during that day's own scheduled military briefing with senior officers and staff. A last-minute interruption meant Stauffenberg only managed to arm one of the 2 devices before the briefing itself actually began, a rushed compromise that would prove considerably more consequential than anyone involved in the plot could have specifically anticipated at the time, since a second armed charge might well have compensated for whatever accidental interference the first bomb's own placement eventually encountered. Stauffenberg entered the briefing hut, placed the briefcase on the floor as close to Hitler as he could reasonably manage, without drawing suspicion from the roughly 24 officers and staff already present in the room, and excused himself from the room shortly afterward under the pretext of taking an urgent telephone call, a plausible cover story that let him leave the building entirely before the bomb was actually scheduled to detonate at its own preset time. What happened next depended entirely on a single officer's own unthinking, entirely accidental gesture, a detail historians have since spent decades examining precisely because of how much actually turned on it. Colonel Heinz Brandt, taking his own seat at the same crowded conference table sometime after Stauffenberg had already left the room, found the briefcase positioned awkwardly near his own feet, and without any awareness of what it actually contained, moved it slightly to the other side of a heavy oak support leg holding up the conference table itself, a small act of simple physical convenience rather than any deliberate intervention. That small, thoughtless adjustment placed a considerable mass of solid oak directly between the bomb and Hitler's own position at the table, a physical barrier nobody involved in either planning or executing the assassination attempt had specifically anticipated, needing to account for when the briefcase was first positioned. When the bomb detonated at exactly 12:42 that afternoon, the explosion tore through the wooden briefing hut with devastating force, killing a stenographer instantly and mortally wounding 3 additional officers who would die from their own injuries in the hours and days that followed, including Brandt himself, the very man whose own accidental gesture had just saved the life of the man the bomb had actually been built to kill only minutes earlier. Hitler survived the blast with injuries genuinely minor, considering the scale of the explosion that had just torn through the room around him: a perforated eardrum, singed and shredded trousers, minor scrapes, and a temporary case of conjunctivitis. Injuries that left him shaken but entirely capable of continuing to function as Germany's own head of state within hours of the attack itself. Stauffenberg and his own aide, watching the hut collapse in a cloud of smoke and debris from a safe distance outside, became genuinely convinced nobody could possibly have survived an explosion of that scale. And the 2 men bluffed their own way past 3 separate military checkpoints and departed the Wolfschanz compound entirely, flying back toward Berlin to help coordinate the broader coup the conspiracy had already set in motion under the codename Operation Valkyrie, a plan that depended entirely on Hitler actually being dead and unable to countermand it personally. Operation Valkyrie itself initially proceeded with real momentum once Stauffenberg's own co-conspirators in Berlin received word the attack had apparently succeeded, reserve army units beginning to move against key government and Nazi Party installations, exactly as the plotters had spent months carefully planning in considerable secrecy. That momentum collapsed almost entirely once the truth of Hitler's actual survival became impossible to continue denying to soldiers and officials increasingly uncertain which side of the unfolding coup they should actually be following. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels broadcast the news publicly, and Hitler himself delivered a live radio address that same evening, his own voice alone serving as unambiguous, unavoidable proof to soldiers across Germany that the coup's own central premise had already failed before it had even properly begun to seize the country's own actual levers of power. Hitler reportedly told those around him afterward that Providence itself had spared him that day, a claim Nazi propaganda would go on to repeat and amplify for the remainder of the war as evidence of his own supposedly divinely protected destiny, a narrative considerably harder for ordinary Germans to dismiss once photographs of the destroyed briefing hut and Hitler's own tattered trousers began circulating publicly. The conspiracy unraveled with brutal speed once Hitler's own survival was publicly confirmed beyond any remaining doubt. Stauffenberg and several of his own closest co-conspirators were captured that same night at the Bendler Block, the Berlin headquarters building where the coup's own coordination had actually been based, and executed by firing squad in the building's own courtyard shortly after midnight, barely 12 hours after the bomb itself had actually detonated in East Prussia. The wider crackdown that followed extended considerably beyond the immediate plotters themselves, and estimated several thousand people eventually arrested across Germany on suspicion of involvement or sympathy with the conspiracy, a purge that eliminated much of what remained of any organized internal German resistance to Hitler's own continued rule for the remainder of the war that followed. Stauffenberg's own attempt was neither the first nor, historians studying the broader resistance movement have since confirmed, the only serious attempt made against Hitler's life across the length of the war, though it remains by far the closest any single conspiracy actually came to succeeding. An earlier plot had attempted to place a bomb aboard Hitler's own personal aircraft, a device that failed to detonate due to a mechanical fault in its own timer mechanism, and several other conspiracies had been abandoned at various planning stages once the specific opportunity each plan depended on failed to materialize as expected. Operation Valkyrie itself had originally been designed as an entirely legitimate contingency plan authorized by Hitler's own government specifically to allow the reserve army to restore order in the event of internal unrest, forced labor uprisings, or an SS-led coup attempt from within the Nazi Party's own ranks, an irony historians have often noted, given that the conspirators eventually repurposed the exact same plan Hitler's own government had created to protect itself into the mechanism meant to remove him from power entirely. The conspiracy itself extended considerably beyond Stauffenberg's own individual role, drawing together a genuinely diverse coalition of senior military officers, career diplomats, and civilian officials who had, in many cases, spent years quietly cultivating contacts with each other while continuing to serve within the very government structure they were secretly working to overthrow. General Ludwig Beck, a former Army Chief of Staff who had resigned in protest of Hitler's own pre-war expansionist policies, served as the conspiracy's own intended head of state had the coup actually succeeded, while Karl Friedrich Gordeler, a former mayor of Leipzig, had already been designated to serve as the new government's own chancellor once Hitler's own removal had been confirmed. That breadth of involvement across military, diplomatic, and civilian circles reflected years of careful, dangerous organizing conducted entirely in secret, since discovery at any point during that extended planning process would have meant immediate arrest and execution for everyone involved, regardless of how far the actual conspiracy had progressed toward its own eventual attempt. The conspirators' own post-war reputation followed a considerably slower, more complicated trajectory than the moral clarity later popular memory has generally attached to their attempt, a rehabilitation that took decades to fully develop within German society itself. In the immediate post-war years, many ordinary Germans continued viewing Stauffenberg and his own fellow plotters with genuine suspicion or outright hostility, some regarding the attempt as a betrayal of soldiers still fighting and dying at the front rather than a legitimate act of resistance against a leadership already steering the country toward total destruction. West Germany did not formally begin honoring the conspirators as genuine national heroes until well into the 1950s and 60s, decades during which the Bendler block itself, the same building where Stauffenberg had been executed in its own courtyard, gradually transformed from an ordinary government office building into a formal memorial site, now known as the German Resistance Memorial Center, that receives visitors from around the world specifically to learn about the wider conspiracy. Stauffenberg's own attempt has since come to represent most prominently in public memory. This is not a story about a single dramatic moment of heroism that simply failed through bad luck alone, since the conspiracy's own actual collapse involved considerably more than one accidentally moved briefcase, delays, and communication failures in Berlin that let the coup lose its own critical momentum, even before Hitler's survival was publicly confirmed to soldiers still uncertain which orders they were actually supposed to be following that afternoon. It is a story about how thin the actual margin between two entirely different versions of the rest of the Second World War genuinely was, a margin measured in the width of a single table leg and the handful of seconds it took one officer to move a briefcase without ever knowing what he was actually moving or what moving it would ultimately cost him personally within the same hour, a single unthinking gesture that altered the trajectory of a war already consuming millions of lives across multiple continents simultaneously. The regime's own response extended even beyond the arrests and executions of individuals actually connected to the conspiracy itself, invoking an old Germanic legal concept called Sippenhaft, or kin liability, that held entire families collectively responsible for the actions of a single relative, regardless of their own personal involvement or knowledge of any plot whatsoever. Stauffenberg's own wife and children, along with the families of numerous other conspirators, were arrested and interned, some of the younger children placed in state-run homes under changed names specifically to sever any remaining connection to their own father's actions, a punishment extended to people who had, in many documented cases, no advance knowledge their own relative had been involved in any conspiracy at all before the arrests themselves actually began. That policy reflected the same totalitarian logic that had already shaped so much of the wider Nazi state's own approach to dissent and resistance throughout the war. Collective punishment applied specifically to discourage any future conspirator from believing his own family might somehow remain insulated from the consequences of an attempt against Hitler's own life. Claus von Stauffenberg's own final words, according to multiple witness accounts from the courtyard where he was executed, invoked "Long live sacred Germany," a phrase that has since become closely associated with the broader German resistance movement he had ultimately given his own life attempting to lead, a movement history has since worked considerably harder to properly document and honor than the German state itself managed to do in the immediate years following the war's own conclusion. The war itself continued for another 9 months after that single July afternoon, consuming millions of additional lives on every side of a conflict. A successful assassination might, at least theoretically, have ended considerably sooner than it actually did, though historians studying the plot since have generally cautioned against assuming any single alternative outcome. Even Hitler's own death that specific afternoon would necessarily have produced a swift or straightforward end to a war already driven by considerably more than one man's personal leadership by that late stage of the conflict. Nazi propaganda seized directly on the plot's own failure as evidence of Hitler's own supposedly unbreakable connection to national destiny, staging elaborate public displays intended to project strength and continuity precisely at the moment internal fractures within the regime's own military leadership had briefly become visible to the wider German public for the first time in years. Newspapers published photographs of Hitler shaking hands with Benito Mussolini during a previously scheduled visit that same afternoon, images deliberately timed and released to suggest business had continued entirely as normal, despite the explosion that had torn through the briefing hut only hours earlier. That propaganda effort largely succeeded in the short term, most ordinary Germans learning of the plot only through carefully managed official channels that framed the conspirators as a small, isolated band of traitors rather than the genuinely broad coalition of senior officials the conspiracy had actually represented. Germany's own military and political apparatus, by the summer of 1944, had already developed institutional momentum extending well beyond any single individual's own personal decisions, meaning even a genuinely successful assassination might have produced a considerably messier, more contested transfer of power rather than any immediate, clean end to the war itself. A sobering counterfactual historians continue debating without any real hope of ever reaching a fully settled consensus on the question. If you want more stories about the margins measured in inches that decided how a war actually ended, subscribe, and we will keep finding them for you. See you in the next one.